Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is Life. Life. So amazing that you can only take 12 to 16 hours of it before you want to lay down and give up. Life. Try one today. So, quick run through of the draw. My wrist is still pretty cooked, waiting on an MRI. So not going to be able to type the volume that it would take to do the write-ups this week. So you're stuck listening. I'm sorry. If you hear sniffling during the video, I'm not sick. I'm just crying. I looked at the menu prices at the US Open this week. So Jannik Sinner had to withdraw last week in Cincinnati. Not a major cause for concern. It does make things a bit more interesting. You know, coming into this event, if he had won Cincinnati, I think it would look pretty clear for him to win the title here. Given Alcaraz's level going into the finals, I thought the finals was going to be pretty tough for Sinner. You know, you just won the last big title. The other guys are looking for vindication. Very easy to get complacent there or you know, to try to be on a fact-finding mission for the US Open clash that's likely to happen here. Since it was an illness, not an injury, I think Sinner will recover. You know, food poisoning, you can recover in 4 or 5 days and be at full strength. If it's the flu, something like that, even if he needs medication, something like a Z-Pack will, you know, get you back to, you know, good form in about a week. The good news for him is his draw here is pretty simple early on. He's probably going to play, you know, Kopriva, Poprin, and then I think Fucsovics, which is relatively safe for him. You know, Fucsovics could be a tough physical test. Poprin has a good offense, but these guys are not really complete players as far as his level. So, you know, Kopriva is a good ball striker, plays solid. He won't give up. So it'll be a good look, you know, at Sinner's early health. I'd look at his cardio more than anything just to see, because there is a bit of weakness after food poisoning or a flu, something like that. But Sinner should win in 3. You know, or 4 at the worst, you know, if he's really not ready to play, or if he's looking to, you know, find his range or get match practice. Not really much concern, though, early in the draw, though. And overall, by the second week, I think he should be fine. Ruusuvuori, Poprin, you know, Ruusuvuori's 1-4 in his last 5. His last match out, he got zipped by Jerome Kim. Jerome Kim is playing really solid right now, but, you know, getting 2-0 is not a sign that you're beating Poprin. You know, Poprin has inconsistency issues, but Ruusuvuori's having them on his own. You know, the level could be there. If he keeps grinding, he could get back on tour, but for now, just too easy there for Poprin. Boo is having a great week. He made the quarters of Winston-Salem. I've really liked his game at times, but the past few months, he's been up a break, you know, serving for sets in a lot of situations, and he lost those sets. It's troubling. You know, it's could be a mental block. It could be the players have just kind of mapped out his game, but in any event, I don't really see any easy matches for him on tour anymore. You know, it's kind of like Mariano Navone. He's very consistent and, you know, tough to hit through from the baseline. Good defender, but you can't really do that forever. And that's kind of what's been happening to Boo. So playing, you know, Valentin Royer is difficult. Royer has a really good serve, probably more reliable than Boo's. You know, these are fast conditions. The weather this week is around, you know, 80 most days, and 80 is not bad for tennis. You know, you're not gonna pass out or have heat issues, but there's no shade on the courts. It is hot and the ball flies, so tough to play a good offense there. I think that will be close. You know, given Boo's level, he should win. But, you know, it's been 3-4 months of should win for him. You know, he's been in spots where he, you know, should have won. He had a good win against Tsitsipas this week, but Tsitsipas is kind of donating wins at this point. So I think that's a closer match than the recent results might indicate. You know, Boo probably wins in 5. Fucsovics and Shapovalov probably will be close. You know, Dennis seems to play his best tennis at random 250s. I think sometimes he's just so much better than everyone there that he gets to play the way he wants to and still win. at the, top tour level. I think the rallies are too long for him. I think he's a little bit too willing to create, and the other guys are stingy. The other guys are not giving up much. They're willing to grind, and they know that the points are there if they do. The second Dennis gets upset, he loses. He's not a guy who gets upset and plays well and pumps his fist. He's a guy who gets upset and double faults and, talks to his box. And, it's fine to let it out, I guess, but I think your opponent always sees that. And I think, when the book on you is that you can get frustrated, it just makes life tougher on you. Rublev during his slump, I think these slumps tend to last longer because of that. It's hard to get out of it when the other guy is actively getting encouraged and, zoned in. Plus, I don't think the other guy's going to make mistakes or go for anything silly if he has it in his mind that you're going to fold. So Fucsovics is in the finals right now in Winston-Salem. He got a walkover from Korda, which takes away from some of the fatigue aspect. So I think, Fucsovics is the guy I think will come through there. I don't love Shapo's, level in close sets. I feel like once it gets to 5-all, he starts double faulting and he doesn't stop, and he's a tremendous player, but, I think the book on him is that he should be somewhere in the top 10 consistently. And the fact that he's not, just speaks to, a lack of awareness on court. I think that's a coaching issue for him is he needs someone to come in and really iron out his patterns. Working with someone from the Spanish Federation might help because they tend to have very good shot selection. Shapo losing to Luca Nardi and Leonard Tien, it's not bad, but, that means Fucsovics can beat you. They've split the previous meetings 2-2 also, so it won't be like Fucsovics can't figure out how to win. Bublik and Cilic might be sneakily close. Bublik hasn't played since his title in Kitzbühel. That's the first time I think I've pronounced that city near correctly, so I'm not going to say it again. Cilic hasn't played since Wimbledon, so, there's been no injury info. Bublik pulled out of he pulled out of Cincinnati, he pulled out of Toronto, but he didn't really say why. If he's less than 100%, this is tough because Cilic beat him the last 3 times. I think Cilic's height in particular gives him extra reach, and it makes him a good returner against these guys with big tee serves. Bublik's best serve on both wings on both sides of the court is his tee serve. And, if you can block that back in play, suddenly it gets tricky. Cilic being 3-0, the last one was in 2022, but still it shows that he can somewhat deal with the offense, because the offense has always been there. The consistency and the desire is bigger now for Bublik, but still a slight issue. I think the upset is very possible there. I might pick Cilic. I guess I have to pick someone. So that's what I'd go with. Cilic has a lot of bad losses at the challenger level, and I wrote him off, but at Wimbledon he showed he still can level up. So I think for some of these guys at the end of their career, they're not really looking to win challengers. They're looking to be close enough and in good enough form that when they get one last big shot, they're able to capitalize. So I think Cilic can win there. I would be happy to see, peak Bublik. I think everyone would. Just, with no matches, playing a tricky opponent. It's not a spot where I expect him to be totally committed. Lorenzo Sonego is playing decent. Skulkate just lost to Bazafaretti last week. It's not a bad loss, but Sonego's a little bit better than him, and he's playing decent. The offense is clicking, so fast hard court. I think he'll be a little bit better. I really like Skulkate's game when he's playing well, but he does tend to go through slumps where he looks a little bit physically weaker than he does at his peak. So Sonego should probably win that. Borges not really doing great. Every match he plays tends to be close. So I think he'll win this in 4 at best. Brandon Holt is a solid player. He hits the ball very flat at times, which is good for the U.S. Open conditions. He just hasn't really materialized in terms of the early promise. He has had some heroic runs. He did very well at the U.S. Open one year, but just kind of fell back to a challenger level. Seems like a grinder at this point. And Borges is a more experienced grinder, maybe a bit more physically durable also. So be very surprised if Holt wins there. Moeller is going to be good right now, really only on clay. He has a good enough serve to make it interesting, but, Tommy should win. Tommy's been pretty bad lately. He lost to Manarino recently. There's nothing really to say that he's going to wake up here and go on a deep run. It's one of the first majors where I feel like he's beatable. But Muller just doesn't have the hardcore game for it yet, I don't think. Musetti has outlasted Pericard, in their two previous meetings. One of them was at Wimbledon, which is a pretty good sign, I think, because, it's a server's paradise, I guess you could say. I guess I said it, so I gotta stick with it, even though I don't know why I said it. It's a server's paradise. Yeah. Well, Pericard played pretty well last week, showed some signs of life. He won a few matches. He beat, let's see who he beat. He beat Medvedev, which is a good win. He beat Muller, which I really like that result. But losing to Botic, Botic is in great form. He's in the finals, but I don't really rate the loss. I feel like Pericard is not really playing his best right now. If he serves really well, he could beat Musetti. It was tricky, halfway through the week last week, I was thinking the upset was there. But, Musetti in a long format is pretty tough to beat. And he serves, I think, well enough to, get to tiebreakers. And likely the guy, I think, that gets a few more balls in play in those moments. So just a tough game for Musetti. I picture kind of the Kevin Anderson versus Nadal situation where, he has opportunities. Pericard will have the ball in his racket at times, but just hard to come up with the offense for a whole 5 sets, especially when, you haven't been playing that great lately. Goffin is just really not ready to play tennis lately. He's having trouble keeping the ball in the court. Still going pretty aggressive, but, Halys lost to Kachanov in 3 last week, and that's better than what, Goffin has done. Goffin is on a skid here. I watched the Baez match. It looked like Goffin was trying to lose. I watched the Martinez match. Same story. It's just not, he's not ready to play right now. So hard to expect him to step it up just because he wants to. Brooksby, Vukic have split matches. It's a real close one. I think Vukic at his best is a top 40 player. The rest of the time, just a lot of errors, and his backhand starts to look weak. He's a good athlete with a good serve, but sometimes it feels like he just feels awkward on the court. He's not really flowing. He's just kind of fighting the ball off, and that's fair in tennis. It's hard to play. I think Brooksby keeping the ball low will, pay dividends here. Brooksby has been very good and very strangely poor at times this season. He's, been struggling through some matches on a slight skid here. Losing to Kachanov is not bad, but he looked harmless in that match. It just wasn't a good showing. But he should win, The longer format, I think, gives him more chances to outlast somebody. Cabali, Passaro should be solid. They've played once before. It was 3 sets, but it was on clay. I think Cabali is just playing a little too good right now. Passaro is really playing at the challenger level. It's good quality tennis, but Cabali should win. Diallo, Zhumer, a lot of people are just expecting Diallo to automatically win now, but he lost to Medvedev. He had a withdrawal. It's not really great. The Wimbledon match he played against Fritz was tremendous. He's proven he can play at the high level, but this is probably going to be tricky. Zhumer can really grind, and it's just about return of serve, I think. If Zhumer can put returns in play, he can win because he's a little bit faster than Diallo, a little bit more consistent. Taking care of his own serve might be tricky. I guess Diallo should win that. I just don't think it's I don't think it's going to be straightforward at all. I don't think you can shut Jumer out at this point. Alcaraz couldn't do it. So expecting Diallo to maybe get it together. I just wonder, he's had such a good season and a half here. I wonder when, he kind of goes a little flat. As you get better and better, you start to kind of go more aggressive and just expect things to fall. And then when they don't for a week or two, it's easy to lose, a few matches against players who are just hungrier than you, I guess. So I think that'll be close, Diallo, and, 4 or 5. I guess. It's tough to just guess the generic predictions, but it's kind of all you have, going in is you're just kind of storytelling and adding up the, variables. Faria actually beat Munar in their previous meeting in 3, but it was on clay, so we can kind of kick that out here. Munar hasn't been unbeatable lately. Even on hard court, he still has to grind. Could be close. Faria is lucky to get this lucky loser spot. I guess losing to Blanchet is not really an indicator he's going to beat Munar. It's just going to take a lot of tennis. But I caught a lot of Tomic and Faria, and Faria is very willing and able to grind. He really does have, a great commitment to fight out there, which is everyone should have it, but not everyone does, so I think that'll be close. Munar should pull away. The upset's not off the table there, though. Munar can look really strong at times, but he has a poor attitude. He gets upset about the umpires. He gets upset about calls. And he can look physically weak at times. I don't really know exactly with some of these guys why they look like a different athlete at different times. It could be, a training regimen. It could be a different climate that they prefer. It could just be slight injuries or fatigue that we're not really getting informed of. But, all these guys can kind of beat each other. So, when on their given day, especially with momentum, the crowds of the U.S. Open are not very biased, I'd say, when players are not from the U.S. or China or Japan. There's not really a huge crowd for the other countries. So I feel like what I saw at qualifiers was the crowd will clap for a good point, but a lot of the times they're just quiet. So a few people in the crowd, can really make an impact. And at the same time, if one guy is fighting, the way Faria does, and one guy is kind of complaining the way Munar does, it's easy to get the crowd on your side. That'll give you energy. And, I'll say the Tomic Faria Stadium was packed in a manner that not many other qualifier matches were. So should be interesting there. I guess Munar just wins and tennis remains kind of boring, but, we can hope. Bergs is not really playing his best, but Sang is not really that good on hard court, just really working with a strong backhand at this point. And it'll be a grind. Bergs is not hitting the ball through you. He's not hitting you off the court. He's not acing you, but he is a bit stronger and a bit more consistent right now, so he should win that. Gomez was one of the most exciting qualifiers. Just pulled an upset every single round. He beat Grenier in a match where they got in each other's faces after the second set. Were arguing pretty heavily. Got pretty toxic. Grenier was going to the line in the third set. He would see Gomez going to his towel, and Grenier would just go to his line and complain to the umpire. He told the umpire she wasn't doing her job. But I don't really know. I know you're supposed to play to the speed of the server, but if the server's just blatantly going to the line, you need a towel, I guess. I'm not a fan of. I don't think the players absolutely need a towel, but if your hands are wet, the racket can slip. You want these players playing their best, and taking a few seconds between points is pretty standard. So it seemed like they got over it at the end, but Gomez has a lot of energy. He's a really good athlete, and he's going after his forehand really strongly this week. He's just absolutely hitting it full commitment on every shot, and that makes things tricky because he has a big first serve. His backhand, I don't think, will hold up against Draper. Draper hasn't been playing, had some injury issues, but he played okay in the doubles with Pegula. I thought that was a good warm-up for him, enough that he will hit the ball well, and so I think he'll outlast Gomez. Tricky spot, though. You don't want to play a guy with a big offense if you have a chance of being vulnerable, because at the end of a set, if it's a tiebreaker and Gomez gets up at 5-6, there's a very good chance he could just thump two aces and then hit one return, and that's it. Now you're down a set. And I think for Draper, playing his first 5-set match, not that it has to go 5 sets, but I think playing that that first match is a question mark here. I don't expect a deep run from him here, even though he has a decent draw. So question marks for him. Should win, but not really the easiest first round opponent. I will say that Gomez has had some lapses in the second sets at times. He had a 10-15 minute service game. I put some clips up earlier this week, and one of them was mostly Gomez clips. And if you look in the background of those, almost every single point was from his service game at 2-3 in the second against Klein. He just he has points where he just kind of gets stuck in a rut, and he's a very emotional player in a good way. He gets excited when he wins a point, and he competes hard, but he also takes it kind of rough when he loses a point. At one point he told his coach, "Stop talking to me," basically during that game. And then 2 points later, he was high-fiving his coach as he passed by. And I heard him saying to himself, "It's just work. You just have to work." Good attitude, and him winning on hard court is really good for his chances of getting on tour, because he is a really solid clay court player. Tabilo had a good week last week in Winston-Salem. He qualified, lost to Suresh, who's a pretty promising player. If Tabilo went somewhere else in the draw, he might have won a match or two. Playing Zverev is a little too tough at this point. Zverev still has the same block against the top players where he just, he thinks he's better than he is, and it prevents him from taking risks and executing in those big moments. He thinks his normal game is going to get him there, and it isn't. And, if you watched him play early in his career, you know that he's capable of going for more. So he's playing this measured style, and it's very gradually cementing him at the top of the game. But it's also preventing him from getting outside of that game and winning the big titles that he wants, that he thinks he's in contention for. And he's just not. Here, if Sinner has some physical struggles, might be the best chance, since that U.S. Open against Thiem, for Zverev to get a major, because he can beat most of the other players in the draw. And he does okay against Alcaraz. But still, he's the one kind of limiting his own ceiling at this point, and he has been for a while. So, should win that match. RBA is playing solid again. Fernley just hasn't really won matches lately. It would be surprising to me if he was consistent enough to win that. Roberto's going to make you play a ton of tennis. And, Fernley has a good forehand, good serve, but hasn't really been at his best, the past couple months. Monfils, lost to Barrios Vera recently, not really putting in his best effort at these, lead-up events. But I just don't think he cares too much about them anymore. He plays for the crowd. He doesn't have to grind it out, and it doesn't seem like he wants to either. It seems like, in a bigger moment, he might step things up. I think he should beat Safiullin. Safiullin has not been winning matches at all lately. I'm giving Monfils an excuse. I think Safiullin needs to win matches. Losing to O'Connell, tells me you're not going to hit through Monfils. Same thing with Rune. Same thing with Ruud. He's losing to the guys that are going to grind you down, and that's what Monfils will do. So I think it'll be exciting. I think there'll be a tiebreaker or two, but Monfils should win in 4. Harris, lucky to get a lucky loser spot. He lost to Coleman Wang in the final round of qualifying. Pretty good stuff from him. Wang played really well. Harris is serving decent. He beat Trotter in the qualifiers in a good performance. I thought Trotter kind of Trotter kind of lost the plot. Harris was just putting the ball back in play, and Trotter was trying to create, and he started making errors, and he never really put it together that, Harris wasn't really creating his own opportunities aside from his serve. Felix won a few matches, recently in Cincinnati. He's still a flight risk, in any match, but I think he should win here. I think he has a bit of a physical edge on Harris and should utilize it. The fact that Harris is a very consistent performer, I think, and a good server means, there'll be a lot of games won on his side. Still like Felix, though. Humbert and Walton, is pretty interesting. I think Walton recently beat Medvedev, and Humbert's been struggling. So on paper, it's an interesting spot. I just think, the day that Walton played Medvedev, I was actually looking through the draw for, players that were not going to fare well in the heat. And Medvedev is one of those guys who, it's 90 degrees. He's in Ohio. He's not going to put in his best effort. He's going to get frustrated. He's going to get cooked. And it's not just a mental thing. He has some physical issues in that severe heat. So Walton was able to outgrind him. I don't think he can do that to Humbert, but Humbert is, still coming back from that wrist injury, not really consistent yet. I just think he has, the offense to get through here, and I don't think the conditions are going to cook him the way they did for Medvedev. So I'm slightly crossing that win off for Walton. It's a great win. It's the best win of his career, but not a total domination, I'd say. The conditions did help. Kovacevic is in trouble there. I think Wang was one of the most exciting players in the qualifier. Every single match he was at had people, the gallery was packed. He's playing really well. He's playing really consistent. He's going after his shots. And Kovacevic has been, hit or miss lately. He can serve well, and that's when he plays well, but I don't think he's going to outlast Wang. Honestly, I think Wang wins that. Duckworth-Boyer could be close. Duckworth is never shutting anybody out, but he played really well in the qualifying. He was tenacious. He outlasted McCabe, and then had a good fight against Piros in the finals. Piros is hitting his forehand really well, so that's not really a bad loss. Boyer lost to Blanche. Not a bad loss either. I think Darwin Blanche is probably going to get on tour. He seems like a very solid player. Actually plays a bit like Shelton in terms of forehand shot selection. He spreads it really well throughout the court, and that matters because a lot of lefties in the past have kind of just gone cross court most of the time and mostly shaped the ball down the line. But this generation seems to be able to hit the ball flat inside out, kind of like Alexander Bolt, and it's helping them. So I think Duckworth can outlast him there. Should be close. Dino Prismic is playing great, qualified, won a challenger title, leading into that. So it's the kind of match where Rublev, if he implodes, he could actually lose, I think. I don't really expect it. Prismic doesn't have wins at that level. It would be kind of surprising. And, you look at Rublev's week in Cincinnati, and 3 sets with Alcaraz is great. I thought Alcaraz kind of lost the plot returning there. Or maybe he was just having difficulties. It's easy for me to say he should put returns in play. He might be trying to. I mean, of course he's trying to, but just seemed like a slight lapse in attention at times, though. In these lead-up hardcourt events from Alcaraz, I feel like he always drops sets that he doesn't really need to. And then at the majors, he's a different player. So I think Rublev wins there. At least one of the sets, I think Prismic is going to be effective. How Rublev handles that is, well, it's up to him, but I think Rublev in 4. Kachanov should beat Basavilbaty. Basavilbaty is, he's having a great career so far. but without maybe great results is the way I'd put it. He's been in a lot of spots where he's playing a player, in the top 50, and he's slated to do well, and he's done well, but he hasn't crossed the finish line. And, it makes you confident, it gives you experience, but it doesn't help your ranking. So he's still kind of looking for that, that run of match wins that, gives him some comfort that he's going to remain on tour for a while. So Kachanov is a rough start. I think he's a bit too solid on the backhand wing for Zverev to beat him. Nishesh is very skillful player, accurate, times the ball well, but not really, an explosive player. Tends to grind people down when he's playing lower level players, so I think Kachanov should win. Medvedev is, playing great tennis right now. Just went on a deep run at Winston-Salem, so I think, Hugo Dellien is mostly a clay courter and has a good first serve, has a strong forehand, but I think, Medvedev's thing is being consistent and kind of overwhelming you. He takes the ball very early, so I think the style that Dellien plays in of trying to run around his backhand and hit the big booming forehand, I think he'll just give up court position and get exposed there. I think Medvedev wins that in 3. Rietti's playing really well. He flexed his leg at the end of the first round of qualifying, and I thought he might be on his way out. Played Verton in the next round and cooked him, and he's playing really well. He's serving really well. This is a guy who's qualified for majors before. He has a great offense. He's one of the best performers of the Challenger Tour. So, Pedro Martinez is a good test for him. He should win. But, when you actually get out there against Martinez and he's putting every ball back in play and he's putting the ball in tricky spots and he's hitting the ball as hard as he can, suddenly it becomes difficult. So this is a real test, I think, of Rietti's attention and stamina. He should win a close one. But it's just never as easy as you think. And I think in a first round, the pace the matches are played at in terms of the rallies makes it difficult to really assert yourself, even if you're really, a more skillful player or have more variety. I think the other player is just booming the ball, and it's tough. Excuse me, I sneezed. A lot of extra noises here. Hiccups, sneezes, sniffles. I'm struggling. Arnaldi Cerundolo. Cerundolo retired in Cincinnati, so Arnaldi has a chance. He just hasn't been winning matches. He hasn't been consistent about hitting the court. I think that's a real issue for a guy who's a great baseliner. Is not having full confidence in his swings because he tends to decelerate now and just gotta, place the ball in. And then, when you're doing that, when it's time to take the big swing, you can take too big of a swing. It's just better to kind of find a middle and be very measured. I think that's one thing Djokovic always did is, he hits the ball as hard as he can, but he looks to kind of find that middle between defense and offense where he's always hitting the ball cleanly and he's always injecting a little bit of pace. I think Arnaldi would do well to try to do the same. I see him taking, big swings and half swings, and just really hard to play consistently while you're doing that unless you're, I guess playing guys you're better than. He 2 years ago, I would say he would beat Cerundolo, but it's tricky right now. If Francisco is healthy, he should win. He has a bigger forehand. He can play well on hard court. He's done well in Miami before, which is somewhat similar conditions to the U.S. Open. Yeah, that one's a question mark. I like Arnaldi's game there. I think, he can outlast a guy like Cerundolo. I think his defense will pay dividends. But if he's spraying errors, then, he's going to be the less consistent player because the way to beat Cerundolo is really to break down his backhand. He can hit some rally ball backhands into the net when he's going cross court, but you have to be really solid in order to earn those errors, and you're not going to beat his forehand either because he hits the ball huge from anywhere. I feel like he's very good at generating depth from difficult positions on his forehand. So, it's a match where Arnaldi has to kind of do what Rune does to Tsitsipas and just make it a backhand exchange and just, keep the ball in play. Tsitsipas, Muller. Tsitsipas is really just donating wins. He just, the guy has a bit of a temper. He gets frustrated. Losing to Boo is not that good. Losing to Bonzi is not that good. Losing to O'Connell, not that good. Losing to Felix is not that good. Losing to RBA is not that good. Losing to Royer is not that good. Losing to Echeverry is not that good. Losing to Mickelson is not that good. Losing to Gigante, that's not his fault. Gigante was playing amazing in that match, so I'll give him that. But, just you see the plot. There's just a lot of bad losses for him, and Muller tends to be really solid and a ball machine. So I think Muller wins that. It's just crazy to, week after week, when I'm not doing these podcasts, I'm basically calling for Tsitsipas to lose matches, and he keeps losing. And what happens when you're doing that, week in and week out, it's very easy for me to say here he's vulnerable, but week in and week out, the guy loses match after match after match, and it starts to become, it's difficult to lose that many in a row. So the question for me, every time Tsitsipas plays decent in a loss is, is he going to level up next time? Is he going to play better at the majors? This is still a tough match, though, even if he plays well. So I could picture this going 4 or 5 sets. This is one where if Tsitsipas wins, it's a big confidence builder for him because it takes a lot to beat Muller. Right now, Muller probably is the better player. It's he just probably is the better player. Tsitsipas's backhand is having issues still. He's not totally confident. He's having coaching changes, and I don't think he really listens in general to his coaches. I don't think he's very amenable to advice at this time. I think it's the same thing. He'll say himself in press that, I suck. I'm not playing well. I'm not playing up to my standards. But I think that he also internally thinks he's a little better than he is. And, the tour has passed him by and the adjustments need to be made. I think early in his career, he utilized a lot more, variation, a lot more spin and height and defending. And I think now he's trying to trade shots and go big on offense all the time. And it's just not really best for his game. I think it's kind of similar to Denis Shapovalov, where, they want to always be on the front foot, but that's not tennis. You can't really do that. Obviously, Tsitsipas has a pretty bad backhand slice also. It tends to hang high. And, that's something you can change. Players on both tours have great backhand slices. They hit it efficiently, but you can't. I just don't buy it. It seems like a work ethic thing. So I guess I'm done, being mean to him. I'll scroll down. Medvedev should beat Altmaier. Altmaier can be a big match player. Medvedev is in decent form lately, serves well, hits the ball hard, tends to play possum for a while, which I think is okay against Altmaier, because Altmaier is not the best at bringing the ball from low to high. So, the slices are not too bad against a one-handed backhand. I think it could get close. Altmaier is always capable of stepping it up. Lately, just not really playing his best. I'll show you the head-to-head if you're watching. Lost to Bouze. Probably pronouncing that wrong, but Bouze sounds cool. Beat Hanfman, but Yannick's not really playing that well. Lost to RBA. Medvedev beat Diallo. Beat Rindanesh. These are pretty good wins. I think he is more likely to enjoy these conditions, and I think Altmaier will have to kind of find his own game. So I like Medvedev in 4. I could be 3, honestly. I don't know that Medvedev will want to go multiple sets. He's lazy, but he's trying to get out of there. So I don't think he'll just tank a set. Mochizuki Gaston, interesting spot. I didn't think Mochizuki was going to get through his last round of qualifying. He was in some trouble against Galan, and he won. He had a pretty easy draw as far as qualifying goes. Buruchaga is not really that great on hard court. Rodionov hasn't been that consistent lately. Milan is very good. I thought he would win, but not really a hard court spot. Not really a powerful player. He's not going to ace you. He's not going to hit you off the court. He's just going to grind. And he has a strong forehand, but it just was a good draw for Mochizuki. Gaston's been losing. Mochizuki could win. I think he should. I like his quickness. He's very good at net also with the serve and volley. So it's an interesting parity here with Gaston's drop shots and Gaston wants to bring the other player into the short court. I think Mochizuki's very good there. Tends to be accurate also when he's not getting out hit. He places the ball really well on the court. He hits a bit flatter on his forehand and backhand. So if Gaston is not at his best serving wise, I think Mochizuki will beat him in 4. O'Connell, De Minaur. O'Connell has played some good matches. I'd say like 60-70% of the time he's just not that effective and doesn't look that physically strong. And De Minaur is a tough physical test, so I think Alex wins that. 3 or 4. Alex is just, you get out there and his backhand can break down. You can hit big shots. You can attack his serve, but then you get out there and you have to do it for 4 hours, and you have to do it for an hour and a half just to get that one set that you want to win. So I think Alex wins in 3. Djokovic is back. It's really interesting to not have him play at all leading into this. I think, he put out a comment saying he doesn't feel like he feels like he's earned the right to play where he wants to play. And I agree. Let him show up at the 4 majors for the rest of his career if he wants. It's fine. I think it creates some intrigue here against Tien. Lerner's a pretty solid player. It'll be a good test for Djokovic. Djokovic does tend to drop a set early in the tournament, so Tien might be competitive at times. Tien's very professional about his shot selection. He keeps the ball on the court. He grinds hard. He plays hard the whole time. Doesn't really have stamina issues. I'd say his serve is not really strong enough, and I think Djokovic, early on might be close, and I think Djokovic will start to hit, returns that put Tien in really bad spots. So I think Djokovic should win that in 3 or 4. Really interested to see how he's playing, because with Sinner slightly questionable, it starts to, and Djokovic fully rested and not really injured at this point. We're not looking at his neck or his knee. So interesting to see how far he goes here. And again, I'm sorry about the sniffling, but, sandwiches cost $37 at the U.S. Open, and it hurt my feelings. But the sandwich was delicious, but it hurt my feelings. And when your feelings get hurt, you need to eat cookies, which cost $10 at the U.S. Open. And it's a memory you want to forget. So you go get a beer, and the beer is $15 at the U.S. Open. No worries. Just head on over to the Amex, and get a towel to wash your tears. And the towel is $75. Zvajda Piros. Zvajda has actually won both previous meetings. Zachary has been a prospect for a few seasons, and I think it's starting to come to fruition. He really, really played well. He overwhelmed pretty much everyone he played. He beat Huesler in the final round pretty easily. It feels like Zvajda is just putting really good depth on his shots on his backhand and his forehand. And, the ball slides a little more than other locations here at the U.S. Open. So it's he's thriving behind that. He has a good serve. Piros is hitting his forehand really well. That's how he got through qualifying. Guys let him play first. They were looking to kind of outlast him, and they just gave him opportunities to control rallies, and he did. And I think, the path past him is to just find his backhand. I think Svajda will do that. I think also Svajda's ability to send his backhand straight with depth is useful. Because Piros is running around his forehand a lot and hitting inside out. So, if Svajda can reflect those with depth, he'll be able to get a ball to work with and get up court. Could be close, but I think Svajda wins that in 3 or 4. Cam Nori, he shows hints of getting back to his old form, and then he loses a couple matches. Korda withdrew last week, so I don't know if that was to, be fresh for the U.S. Open or not. It makes it really tough to really call this match. I know that Korda, the last time I saw them play, Korda really cooked him. His forehand cross-court jumps a lot, and I think that makes it really tough for Cam's backhand to take a good swing at the ball. He likes to just reflect the ball cross-court, and if it's moving sideways on him, it's hard for him to do that with any, pace, and it's hard for him to keep the ball low. So I like Korda in that matchup. It's just a matter of, if he's healthy or not. Withdrawal last week is common. It's common for the big names to withdraw from, the previous week's tournament. But I don't know if Korda's a big name. I don't know if his team is looking at things like that. So that's one to watch. Just, check on how both players are. Because Nori's also a question mark. He just has not been winning matches lately. Mickelson should beat Komazana. Komazana, keep calling him a big match player, but this season he just hasn't really had it on hard court. He hasn't been serving well. He hasn't been automatic against the big hitters. I watched him play Rublev, and it just looked like he couldn't get his way out of a rally unless Rublev missed. So Mickelson should win that. He's serving well. He's playing decent. Tiafoe should beat Nishioka. Nishioka hasn't been really competitive on tour lately. I will say Tiafoe, retired against Rune. He looked, having a difficult time in the heat. He looks in good shape, but maybe he hasn't been training quite as much. He has had half a slump, lately. But, Nishioka with, just 5 losses in a row. That's not bad. But yeah, Tiafoe should win that. He plays his best at the U.S. Open, so you expect a lot from him here. Martin Dam and Darwin Blanche is a really good match. Dam is a solid lefty server. Very fiery player. Gets a bit upset at times in the past. I don't know a great way to put it. It just seemed unpleasant, but that can be useful in tennis sometimes because you're very competitive on the court. It's good to have that presence. I don't know if it'll bother Darwin Blanche. Darwin seems like he has a pretty good attitude. It's two lefties playing each other, so it should be pretty interesting. I think Blanche is better in the baseline. Had a real good week last week, but that's his first real good week, I'd say, at the tour level. So interesting to see how he handles playing, a big server. Can look through his history maybe and see, how he's done against servers. Royer has a pretty good serve. That one was close. I guess there's not a lot of servers at the challenger level, so it's hard to really find a data point. All these guys are baseliners. The Stanic, pretty good serve on him, so. All right, well, I'm not going to find what I'm looking for. But, while I am scrolling, I think you're seeing along with me a ton of wins, and I think he'll win again. He's just a bit more complete at this point than Dam. Struff McDonald, Struff was down multiple breaks in the first set against Taro Daniel in qualifying, and then he was down a break in the second. Then he was down another break in the second, 4-1, and somehow won the match. Pretty ridiculous, but then the next round against Kazo, he played even better. So, he's trending in the right direction. Mackie always makes things close, but he's been on the losing end of some close matches lately, so it makes me a little bit hesitant to believe. Struff serving well should be a big difference there. I think he'll make it a shootout. He'll keep the points short and not let Mackie use his speed. And, Struff's ability to get to net is useful here because Mackie doesn't really pass well with his backhand. So I like Struff in 4 or 5 there. Van de Zandschulp is in the finals of Winston-Salem right now. It's great. All aboard. Get in the boat. Botic is the champ. He's the best. He's the GOAT. No one can beat him. And I can pronounce his name almost. He's 0-2 against Rune, though. So, hopefully he gets that title, He's a guy who struggles with confidence, so making a finals is good for him. He famously beat Alcaraz at the U.S. Open. So, the upsets are on the table. I think Rune's been playing decent lately, though. I think he can expose Bocic's lack of lateral speed. I think that's one thing Rune really does well, is when there's a formula to beat a guy, he does kind of lock in and play well. When the other player is playing really well and moves well, I think Rune starts trying to create on his own and doesn't really have a good idea of what his game looks like in that moment. But here he should win in 4 or 5. Mensik has had some injury issues. Jari playing decent, but still dealing with vertigo at times on tour. Good spot for both, honestly, because they're both a little bit questionable health-wise. Not a great way for me to say who's going to be fine. I think Mensik is a bit more durable from the baseline, a bit less error-prone. They both serve well, so I think it could be a close 4-set win for Mensik. Blanchet Morozan is a spot. Morozan has been playing decent, but you can score on him. I think Blanchet qualifying makes this interesting because winning on tour is a little better for me than being good. I think Morozan has really good technical skills. I think he hits really exciting shots. I think he's another player like Popyrin who's aiming very high with his tennis early in his career. I'm talking about early Popyrin, by the way. But I think that makes him a little error prone, and I don't think he moves. I think he moves well. Like if you run a sprint with Morozan, I think he matches up well against a lot of guys on tour. I think if you run a sprint and you have to change direction and sprint back, I think he loses to most of the guys on tour. And, that's what I see from his game. He can make that first great get, and the next one, maybe not so much. So I think, I don't know, if Morozan doesn't serve well, I think Blanchet can win that. So very, very tricky spot, I think, for Morozan in a first round, playing a qualifier who's playing well, who's pretty solid, who serves decent. A mental test there for Morozan. Speaking of mental tests, Fonseca, Kecmanovic. Kecmanovic is not winning a ton of matches lately, but Fonseca is hitting himself out of some. He has the game to hit past anybody, but will he hit past anybody? Or will he crash out? And he's done a lot of crashing out, and Kecmanovic's best feature is grinding. So I do think Kecmanovic will probably beat him there in 4 or 5. Kecmanovic is a player who can struggle with his own mental struggles, but I just think right now, I just think Fonseca is not quite ready yet. I think his best results are on hard court, but he goes big on every shot. He's certainly capable. You can see that it's gonna be there. Like, I think the only issue right now for Fonseca is he's just not physically mature yet. He's not as strong as the other guys on tour. He's still a bit of a child physically, and it makes it hard to play that high octane tennis all the time because the other guys are hitting the ball really hard, and it's a lot of moving. It's a lot of lunging, and I do think he has a very stable base and he times the ball well. I just think Morozan is I just think Fonseca is a bit error prone at this point, and I don't think he's going to back off that. So spots where he could grind and maybe win, I think he's just going to go for the big shot, and because he knows it's going to be there later. But that means right now somebody like Kecmanovic is the ideal opponent to beat him, and I think he will. I'll be happy. These are spots that I'm happy to be wrong because it means great things for the tournament. Fonseca playing well enough to beat Kecmanovic means he probably goes on a decent run here. He can beat Mahak, because Thomas Mahak is not playing great, and that's the issue in the next round too. Mahak has been injured frequently this season. He's lost a lot of matches. He's done a lot of withdrawing. A lot of losses in a row here. Losing to Mannarino is not great. Mannarino's in good form. Might win his match against Griekspoor, but not really great. Nardi did beat him in 2022, which is not bad. That was a hard court match. Sorry you didn't get a chance to see it. That's Clay, so skip that. I think, it's tricky. Nardi's really not that dominant. So it just comes down to whether Mahak is physically strong. If he's healthy, he should win. He has a quicker offense. It's funny to say somebody who's been injured so long is physically dominant, but he's a bit faster and stronger, than someone like Nardi also. So really would hold off on picking anybody there. I guess you pick Nardi just assuming that Mahak is not going to be healthy, because there's nothing lately that's shown that he is. Nakashima with a tough match against De Jong. Jesper was pretty good in qualifying, got through very quietly. Galbas, Kruger, and Mayo, not the toughest draw ever, but he made quick work of all of them. The matches were over pretty quickly. 6-4, 6-1. Pretty dominant. 48% first serve is probably the reason I think he loses to Nakashima. Nakashima's serving very well. He's become a serve bot, and I think he'll be a more consistent performer there. I also have seen some really good baseline tennis from him. I think that he can lock into a very consistent form. I think he, probably wear down De Jong into some errors, but I think it'll be close. I could see that going 4 or 5 sets for Nakashima. Jerome Kim against Quinn is a pretty good matchup. I think Kim can pull the upset here. Quinn hasn't been really at his best lately. Has a really good forehand. I do like his commitment to going big in big moments. I just think, losses to Nakashima, losses to Mensik, these are fine. Losses to matches, these are fine losses, and he has good wins also. I just think he's always in close matches, and Jerome is playing, really well right now. I thought in particular the match against Michael Zhang was a big win for him. Jerome has been a bit fake in the past. He has a really beautiful game, but it seems like he doesn't really execute, doesn't really win in the big moments, and he really cooked Zhang. Zhang was playing really well, playing, overwhelming baseline tennis when he beat, I forgot who he beat, but might have been, no, it wasn't Uchiyama. Well, anyway, I think Kim is serving a little better than Quinn. I think he's a little sharper, used to the conditions, and even though he won't have the crowd support, I think just that momentum coming through qualifying means he'll get through. And, yeah. Just adding in a fourth noise of me blowing my nose. Hopefully you didn't hear that. Some people say you should pause the recording, but I don't know how to do that. Lloyd Harris, man, he played well in the final round of qualifying against Sun Fashing. I like Sun's game, but Harris just looked like he was playing a child. He's just serving the ball really well. He holds his forehand exceptionally well. It's just really hard to know when he's going to turn it cross court. I think he can beat Baez. Baez is starting to play decent on hard court, but I think Harris is just a little too good on serve, and I think he is such a good athlete and is so patient in the rally that it'll help him against Baez. One of the knocks I think on Harris in the past is that he's a little bit passive in rallies. He's very willing to play possum, hit backhand slices and just kind of, loop the forehand in. And I think that hurts him against more aggressive players. But, one of the ways Baez can beat you is by outlasting you, is by just kind of putting balls back and forcing you to come up with shots. So I think Harris's, conservative approach here at times will help him. In qualifying, he didn't really go for too much until he had the shot. And he executed when he did very cleanly. I feel like, the break from the tour has him feeling very level-headed and calm out there. And, having a huge first serve doesn't hurt. So I think he beats Baez. Fritz and Nava, tough draw for Nava. He's been really grinding lately. Feels like he's been grinding for the last 5 years, honestly, to get near the tour. A well-deserved wild card. Fritz is just at too high of a level right now, I think. He's playing really well. He's a guy you expect to make the second week at most of the majors now, except, Roland Garros. So there's no reason to expect him to fumble here either. He's not injured. He's won some titles this season. He's playing great. Shelton plays Bouze. Ignazio's a good server. Also, a lefty. So good servers battle there. I think Shelton is just a little too strong, in baseline rallies for him. One thing I was saying is Shelton, to make that next leap at the top level, he needs to start going down the line with his backhand and creating that short angle for effect on his backhand. He ironed out the errors. He got away from just slicing everything. He started to just drive the ball across court, which was good. It let him be competitive against, Sinner, Alcaraz. But if you want to score on them, I think you need that, ability to create from that wing that they both have. And I saw it in, was it Cincinnati? I think yeah. No, sorry. It was in Toronto. In Toronto, I saw him really hitting that shot. He was going sharp angles cross court, short angles also, which is the one I'm really looking for, that I think can hurt, Sinner and Alcaraz. And he also drove the ball down the line well. He did exactly what he needed to. And I think that's been a theme with Shelton, in his early career, is that he's actively ironing out the holes in his game while he's on tour. It's something you don't see a lot of players do. You see a lot of players stay exactly the same for year after year. And, you can see he's aiming higher. And I think physically he's putting in the work to catch up to Alcaraz, which is something, I don't see a lot of players doing. Even in the Murray era, the Nadal era, I feel like these guys were, including Djokovic, these guys were putting in more work than the rest of the guys on tour. And you have to match that work if you want to be a top player. Shelton wants to be a top player, and he's matching that work. It's very good to see. I think he should win that in 3 or 4. He's going to have a lot of crowd support this week. Mixed, some mixed criticism of the way he acts on court and his behavior, but I don't think it'll bother the New York crowd at all. I think, New Yorkers are really going to get on board with, the animated way that he plays. He's an exciting player. He's a good kid. Should have a good run here. Pretty simple section of this draw, too. He probably plays Pablo Llamas Ruiz in the second round. Carreño Busta, another guy like Goffin, he's not really playing well right now. Pablo never really had a great serve, which is good because, Llamas Ruiz doesn't either. But Ruiz was really solid in qualifying. He's moving the ball really well. He's very stingy with his shots. He's keeping the ball low. Just pretty much grinded everybody he played down and never really looked uncomfortable out there either. He's, he looked like he knew he would qualify and just getting past people in his way. Very impressive stuff. So I think he'll beat Carreño Busta. I think, Carreño just not really consistent yet. I think when he goes to execute, he's just making a lot of errors and, hasn't won matches lately, whereas the other guy, grinded through a tough qualifier draw. Corentin Moutet should beat Thompson. Thompson's coming back to tour post-injury, and I think that he will start to win matches, but I think Moutet's actually in some of his best form this year. He's playing well. He's hitting his forehand big. His backhand, he was stuck with a one-hander for a while due to a wrist issue, but he has that back now if he needs it, and his backhand did get a lot better from that time playing as a one-hander. So tough for me to see there where Thompson scores cheap points, and I think Moutet can grind longer at this point. Manarino playing really well, beat Tommy Paul in the past month. I think it's trouble for Greek Sport there. A lot of people, I think, agree, which makes me hesitant. Greek Sport did win their one meeting, but it was in 2022. Talon just hasn't won matches lately, and that's, a concern in a big moment because Manarino is tricky. Even if you're going to beat him, he's going to make things difficult. So in this situation, he's making things very difficult. And, here a tiebreaker with Jannik Sinner is impressive. I have to say I think Manarino is just a little bit sharper right now. So I do kind of expect him to win that. It'd be nice, Greek Sport is certainly capable of winning that, but tricky. I think I like Adrian there. Lehechka Coric is a good matchup. Coric is starting to, sorry, not Coric, Coric is starting to get back on tour. It's really good to see. He's a solid player. I just think, his best play has kind of passed him by a little bit. When he serves really well, he still looks like a top 50 player. The rest of the time, he's just a bit of a grinder, and he still has the forehand issues. He can lose his timing on the forehand and get a bit defensive with it. He's lost some close sets lately also, which I think just kind of, it doesn't affect your attitude. You're still playing tennis, but I think you can just kind of casually move into a slump with that. You just start losing the close ones and you start second guessing yourself. And then every time you make a decision and it doesn't work out, you think you made the wrong decision and you didn't. Sometimes you just lose. I think that's where coaches need to come in and tell you that it's part of the process. You're not going to win every match. You're not going to win every tournament. You just have to, keep preparing to do that. I think Lehechka just has better preparation with being on tour. And, he serves a bit better. So I think it's a match he'll win in 4. Echeverry has won most of the meetings with Ugo Carabelli. Carabelli's not really playing tremendous right now. Echeverry is very slowly finding some match wins, so I think he should win that. I can see the finish line, which is nice. Laszlo Djere withdrew, gives a good spot to Galan. I think Galan can beat Collignon. Collignon has a really good serve, good power. I just think he's much better on clay. I don't think he's going to serve his way through Galan. So I like Galan there. I like Djere also. I was a little confused, not to get into gambling chat, but they opened that at even odds, which I thought was strange. I thought Djere, if he's playing decent, is going to beat most players. He's going to beat most clay courters on hard court. He just has more experience at it. He has a pretty good serve. He hits the ball solid. Especially in an early round, his power really means something. It's easy to say you should beat him because he's better on clay, but when you watch him play in person, he booms the ball. So I guess that makes sense. That's why he withdrew. He wasn't 100%. That's why the odds were the way they were. So I like Galan there. I think he should win. He has a bunch of matches under his belt too, which, not a bad thing at all. Casper Ruud is playing some decent hard court, so should beat Offner. Offner is always a threat, but hasn't been totally healthy since he kind of got back on tour. And, that kind of was a story with him before. Very powerful player, but the hiccups are back. Very powerful player, but needs a bit more health. Where do you get the health from? Yeah, lost to Kopriva is not great. Yeah, so I just think Casper will win there. I think in the longer format, it's hard to beat him. And when he's donating wins in random 500s on hard court, it's easy to write him off. But at a major, it's hard to get past him. Medvedev here should kind of reset things. I've seen some decent play from him. He plays well at the U.S. Open. Bonzi is really solid. I think he beat Medvedev once before, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, beat him in Wimbledon. So that's the match where Medvedev talked about how these players play their absolute best against him. Yeah, maybe. I think these guys play their absolute best, whenever they can. It's a pretty straightforward thing. Everybody's trying to win. And, if you start giving them signs that they can win, they're going to play better. I think Bonzi in particular is a guy who, when he gets into a good level of tennis, he stays there for, a whole week. So it's a guy you can't really give a rhythm to. Medvedev, I think, should beat him this time, even with the losses that he's had coming into this. I think, he's just a bit more consistent. I think he serves a little better than Bonzi also, but it probably will be close, because Medvedev is a bit in his head about things at this point. I think he gets frustrated. He yells at his box in a frantic manner. He talked about being excited just to win a match and celebrating, when he jumped up and down after one of his recent matches. And I think as much as I value the honesty, I think he's is very results oriented right now with his emotions, and I don't think that's a good way to be on the court. I think you need to have a bigger vision. I think you need to stay locked in, and I think you need to compartmentalize things. If you don't have that emotional stability, I think you need to just have whether it's a foot drag and a little motion like Nadal does, Osaka does that as well. I don't think it works for her, but or Paolini with the smile after the point. I think you need to have some quick repetitive reset motion that you do that just keeps you from watching the story of yourself. It's hard to watch the story and compete at the same time, and I think competing is more important. So tricky match there. Hopefully he wakes up and wins it. Navone Giron, I feel like Marcos has had a tough run here of matches. Just lost to Navone, so very possible that he loses again. 6-2, 6-2 is really not great. I don't totally know why Giron is losing. He doesn't seem completely injured. I can cheat here and see what they say. Nothing there about injuries, so tricky. I guess Navone just should win again. Giron does have a poor backhand, so I think Navone has one of the better backhands of the clay court grinders, so it's very possible that he gets through just on that. Rinderknech playing decent, and Carballes Baena is not, he's not totally healthy, so it's a spot where I think, if RCB is healthy, you're really tricky out there. But he's been, losing matches. He had a close one with Fritz, but didn't really back it up. Those are interesting results, but Clay, throw that out the window. And 2021, Clay, throw that out the window. So, I think Rinderknech has shown some signs of life this season. So he should win that, but I don't think it'll be easy. Carballes Baena never gives up, never surrenders, never any other cliche. But I just think, Rinderknech should win. That one's pretty straightforward. Shevchenko, Fokina. Fokina withdrew from his last tournament, and so did Shevchenko. So not a ton of reason to think either one of these guys are going to be at their best. I like injured Fokina over injured Shevchenko. Dartari Hijikata. Dartari played really well last week in a match against someone I thought might beat him. It was Mackie McDonald. Yeah, Dartari played really solid there. I think he should win that. Hijikata hasn't been that good lately. Dostanic had some heroics, last week. Played really well, beat Vukic, almost beat Sonego. I would like him against Spaziri, but here you go. Challenger in Lexington, Spaziri beat him 3-2. So, might be closer this time because Dostanic is in a good patch of form. But, the guy just beat him. Bellucci, Shang. I don't really like Shang to win matches until he wins matches. He's coming back off injury. Did okay against Echeverry, but lost. Lost to Duckworth. Bellucci not really playing his best. Kind of lost a lopsided one to Munar, but has won some matches, so I think Bellucci should win that. Alcaraz Opelka, that's a fun first round. If you get tickets for that, you'll get to see a lot of chaos. Opelka plays a really aggressive game, huge serves, obviously. Worth the price of admission, I think, to see Alcaraz returning. Also, Alcaraz will probably be standing, at the bleachers, returning serve there. And also to see Alcaraz drop shot Opelka and see him try to run them down should be interesting. So a lot of highlight rallies probably there. And Alcaraz should win. I'll probably post the women's division this evening. Still have to do a bunch more digging through stuff. Some close matches there too. So, if you made it this far, my credit card number is 659-854-454-5545. And there's no expiration date. And, the code is your birthday. So there you go. Enjoy. Buy something. Just please don't buy anything at the US Open because I don't have that kind of money. All right. Bye.